Welcome to another program in our series, Freethinking Forum. I'm Bill Weir, the producer and host, and I'm delighted to have with me today Mark Bohnhorst, the chair of the state presidential election team of the Minnesota Citizens for Clean Energy. Thank you, Mark, for joining us.
Bill, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You've got an important thing to say, so let's get at it. We're going to change the way in which the Electoral College functions. Is that right?
That's the plan. There are a lot of exciting things going on right now that may make that possible.
And for starters, let's tell us a little more about your background.
Okay, so I'm a retired public lawyer. I worked for 40 years, 16 years at the Legal Aid in St. Paul. I was left as litigation director there, and 24 years at the Office of the General Counsel at the University of Minnesota, mostly supporting its vital research function. So I've had a really privileged opportunity to do some wonderful work before I retired. The Electoral College is the way we actually elect the president. When you go to vote for president, you're not actually voting for president, you're voting for an elector, who will then later vote for president if, in your state, that elector is part of a slate of electors that gets the plurality. So we have a winner-take-all system in 48 of the 50 states, and you're not actually voting for the president, you're voting for electors. I first dimly became aware of the Electoral College system when I first voted in 1968. That's when I turned 21. I knew that George Wallace was up to no good, but I didn't really know what he was up to and didn't pay a lot of attention to it. And I didn't pay much attention to the Electoral College after that because the Electoral College vote and the national popular vote were always aligned with each other, so there didn't seem to be much of a problem. But then 2000 happened, and then 2016 happened, and I really started paying attention.
Well, for you personally, what was the main message, the main impact of the 2000 election?
Yeah, I have this just vivid memory of sitting in the parking lot outside Architectural Antiques on Washington Avenue in downtown Minneapolis with my wife, who's also a public lawyer, listening to the broadcast on the radio of what the Supreme Court had decided. So my first reaction was my lawyer hat saying, how could the Supreme Court possibly be overriding and ignoring what the Florida courts are doing, because the law of federalism, which conservative courts are supposed to be adhering to, you defer to state action. And particularly under the Constitution, it's up to the state to decide how its electors are going to be selected. So that was stunning to me, and then also that they just created this whole new law of discrimination, of equal protection. I've been a civil rights lawyer for 25 years. I couldn't believe they just kind of made this up out of whole cloth. So that was personally and professionally upsetting. In fact, I think David Souter, the Supreme Court Justice, he almost resigned over that decision. As a citizen, personally, I was just offended at the idea that somebody who lost the national vote, would actually win the election. It made absolutely no sense to me. It sort of casts a pall over the legitimacy of the winner. And I was very angry about the third party, the role of the Green Party. It was just so upsetting that third party, because of the way the Electoral College is structured, where all this emphasis is placed on what happens in just one state, one small party can just overturn the apple cart in that state and in the entire country. It's just so arbitrary.
But then 2016 happened.
Yeah, that was worse. That was really terrible. 2.9 million vote difference, and with a winner who, to my mind, threatens democratic principles and threatens the survival of the planet. So that's my other passion is global warming. And I was super concerned because I just read two books, one Dark Money and one Rat F blank blank CKED. And they were about how super conservative, super powerful, wealthy forces were among other things, gerrymandering states outrageously, so that you would have like a permanent, essentially a permanent minority rule government. And what happened in the Electoral College in 2016 was just more of the same.
Okay, so a lot of people had similar reactions. How did you come to take this advocacy role?
Well, it wasn't as a lawyer. I had retired 6 months before then, and I didn't renew my license. It was as a citizen, and I think you and any of your voters could do the same. I think this calls for citizen advocacy. It's a real threat to our democracy. My advocacy started almost by accident. DJ Tice had written an editorial, a long commentary in the Star Tribune in November 2016, defending the Electoral College, saying it was just fine with him. So I wrote a long piece saying, well, it's not fine with me. And I've written a lot of commentaries from time to time, but this one actually got published. So, well, if Strib's going to publish me, maybe I better start paying attention. And then I saw something that just really, I couldn't believe it, that Minnesota, there was a bill in Minnesota supported by some Republicans that would turn Minnesota's electoral college system from winner-take-all to district by district. So each congressional district would elect its own elector, and then 2 electors to the overall winner. And if you could do that in only a few states, it's particularly gerrymandered states, like Virginia and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, then you can make it essentially impossible for a Democrat to win. A Democrat could win by 5 million votes. And because those states are all kind of Swiss cheese, some go here, some go there, and all the other states, all the red states, are just a red wall. If you're a red brick wall of winner-take-all states, then you have no chance. In fact, in 1800, this very issue was presented to Thomas Jefferson, who of course was running for president, and he wrote a letter to James Monroe, another future president, saying this is in fact ensuring to our minorities the appointment of the government, by which he meant the election of the president. So that really got my
I don't understand why Jefferson was writing to Monroe about this in 1800. Couldn't they just follow the intent of the founders? After all, they were the founders too.
Yeah, they were founders. Well, the problem is the intent of the founders was anything but clear. This question of how to elect the president was one of the hardest issues, one of the ones they deferred to the very end of the Constitutional Convention. They weren't quite sure how to do it, and they came up with a plan kind of at the last minute. They seemed to have hoped to have this idealistic idea that these wise people, the electors would be wise people, they would come together and then they would elect a virtuous and wise person to lead the country. Of course, that never happened. They were really worried about factionalism and how they could create structures that would avoid factionalism. And probably the most famous writing on that subject is Federalist Number 10 by James Madison. And at the end of that paper, Madison said, you know, it's the extent of the republic that we're creating. The fact that there are lots of states and lots of different interests and so on that will protect us against factionalism. And an evil-minded person might be able to win the approbation of states, of voters in some states, but that would never spread across the entire United States. So what we have now is actually exactly what Madison thought couldn't happen, which is we have the possibility of individual states being influenced by presidential campaigns or Russians or whatever to fall in line with one candidate, and the breadth of the entire republic does not come to the aid of the country. You know, we just essentially ignore the votes in all the states that are taken for granted, and everything turns on one or two states instead of everything turning on the country as a whole.
So the most powerful office on earth can be attained in that way.
Yeah, and you know this
aside from the vague and idealistic notions of this council of wise men, what can we say now about the intent of the Constitutional Convention in creating the Electoral College?
Well, two things are clear is it was a compromise. Part of the larger compromise between the small states and the large states, and between the slave states and the free states. So the large state, small state compromise was the Senate, and the slave state, free state compromise was the three-fifths rule, in which the free states agreed to accommodate the slave states by allowing 3/5 of the slaves to be counted as persons for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives, and therefore for purposes of Electoral College representation. So the large state, small state issue is kind of a nothing burger, at least in current politics. For example, if you take the 16 smallest states in the 2016 election, 8 went for Clinton and 8 went for Trump.
Evenly divided.
Evenly divided. Doesn't really affect the politics at all.
But what about the election in 1800? That would have gone to John Adams?
Yeah, the 3/5 compromise really did serve the interests of the slaveholders. In 1800, if it weren't for the 3/5 rule, John Adams would have defeated Thomas Jefferson. Mm-hmm. And in fact, some of Adams' supporters said that Thomas Jefferson was carried into the White House on the backs of slaves. Mm-hmm. 10 of our first 12 presidents were slaveholders. The issue came to a head in the 12th Amendment. The 1800 election was a mess because the original Electoral College rules didn't distinguish between candidates for president and candidates for vice president. So if you're voting for two candidates from the same party, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, they each got the same number of votes. And Burr was not willing to defer to Jefferson to become president. So that was just a mess. And in trying to sort out that mess, the issue of slavery came up. And the Northern interests said, we need to take this out of the Electoral College system. You've already got it in the House of Representatives. We need to take this away. And they lost. So that was...
Well, so didn't the Civil War remove the stain of slavery from the Electoral College?
Yeah, sadly, it did not, except for a brief time. You know, the 15th Amendment, one of the Civil War constitutional amendments, gave the right to vote to the ex-slaves. And in 1872, the white power structure saw those ex-slaves help elect Ulysses S. Grant to be president. But then there was a reign of domestic terror. You know, the Ku Klux Klan was riding the byways, terrorizing people. And by 1876, the electoral politics of the South was highly disputed, and in fact, there were competing slates of electors submitted to Congress in 1876 in that election. And they couldn't make up their minds. The Congress created a sort of a committee of investigation to try to figure out what to do with this mess. So there was an Electoral College crisis, and it resulted in another unholy compromise, like the 3/5 compromise, where the Democrats agreed to withdraw their disputed slates of electors. The Republicans won, but the deal was they would abandon Reconstruction. Mm. And with the abandonment of federal oversight of the South, federal presence in the South, in the face of this domestic terrorism that was which was underway, you had the Jim Crow laws, which led to really a century of racial subjugation in the South.
So the structure of political power.
Yeah, the structure of political power became even more favorable to the white power structure, because in the past they could only count 3/5 of a slave for purposes of the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. Now they could count 5/5 of a free African American, except they could terrorize him or her, and him
Wow.
at that time, keep them from voting, and they got more political power than they had
Well,
before.
that century of racial subjugation, that brings us to the modern civil rights era. At the top of the show, you mentioned George Wallace was up to no good in 1968. What did you mean?
Well, he had a plan, basically, to redo the Compromise of 1876. He was going to try to deny either Humphrey or Nixon a majority in the Electoral College, and then extort from them or from somebody else in the process a promise to abandon progress on civil rights in order to get his electoral votes.
Wow.
He had secret agreements with his electors that they would follow his bidding on this, and he almost succeeded in one way or another, because the election was very close. Nixon beat Humphrey by small margins in Illinois and Ohio. George Wallace had large margins, or had fairly large margins in Illinois and Ohio, and if his voters had gone for Humphrey, he would have denied Nixon an Electoral College majority, which would have thrown it into the House, where each state gets one vote. So if the 5 states that had voted for George Wallace for president stuck with him, there might not have been a result in the House, in which case it goes to the vice president, where the Senate decides that between the top 2 vote getters. But Southern senators might boycott the election, and there's a 2/3 quorum requirement, or they might abstain, denying the 51 vote requirement. It could have been a complete chaos,
Yes.
and that was his plan. And it exposed profound flaws in the Electoral College system once again, led to a major movement to amend the Constitution to abolish the Electoral College, a major bipartisan support. George Herbert Walker Bush was then in the House and was a big supporter of the constitutional amendment, passed the House with 30-some votes, but it was killed in the Senate by George Wallace's supporters, the Southern segregationists, with a filibuster. So the Wallace episode, I think, shows 3 things. Really strong bipartisan support to fix the flaws in our system for electing the president. Continuing undercurrent problem with racial prejudice and structural and individual racism. And the weakness of the Electoral College in its ability to be manipulated by third parties, which is just one of the main objections to the Electoral College system.
Well, these 3 lessons raise 3 more questions. First, what do you mean by continuing undercurrent of racial prejudice, structural and individual?
Well, on a structural level, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, following on Selma, where 2 of our co-religionists gave their lives for one of whom you knew personally, for the cause of electoral justice, made a big difference. But structurally, the Electoral College still has this system where if the state is basically taken for granted, you know it's either going to go red or it's going to go blue, then your vote doesn't really count, whichever way you're going to vote in that state. And large proportions of African American voters are in the South, where the states are taken for granted. So structurally, their votes actually don't matter. Similar thing is true of Native Americans in the West, where 8 of 9 states with the highest concentrations of Native Americans they're going to vote red every time, unless unless there's an earthquake in our politics. And the same is true, by the way, of Mormons. So it's not totally a racial and ethnic issue. But after the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, there's been amazing amount of efforts at voter suppression, which is sort of overt efforts at structural racism, if you will. The most recent was in Florida, which passed a constitutional amendment through a citizen initiative campaign that's going to bring 1.5 million people back to the voting booths. except the Florida legislature, or at least one house, has now passed a law under which those former felons are going to have to pay the costs of prosecution as kind of a super duper poll tax. It's just
Wow.
takes you right back to the Jim Crow era of that century of subjugation. And then there are actually individuals. The former governor of Maine, Paul LePage, is talking about how, well, if you reform the Electoral College, doesn't matter for whites to vote anymore. It's going to be the minorities who elect the president. Just a sort of race-based rhetoric. And of course, you see campaign events. Unfortunately, with our current president and his rhetoric, there was a campaign event in Grand Rapids recently with a big line of "Make America Great" supporters snaking out in front of a shelter, I think a women's shelter, and some of the women were trying to get through the line to the door of the shelter, and there were like racial epithets being hurled at them by at least some of the people in line, and none of the other people in line were stepping up to say, no, you shouldn't do that. No, that's wrong. Which I can kind of sympathize with that. I grew up in the Jim Crow South as a kid in the 1950s. I mean, I know when your friends, aggressive friends, are being overt racists, it's kind of hard to stand up and say, no, that's wrong. But I think we all need to stand up and say, no, that's wrong.
Second, you referred to one of the main objections to the Electoral College. Could you run through those?
Yeah, I've touched on many of them already. There's the one person, one vote. The votes don't count equally. This is just basically wrong. When you have a minority government in place, then it flies in the face of everything we've known since kindergarten about how decisions ought to be made. There's the approximately 100 million voters who are simply ignored because they live in states which both parties know are going to go one way or the other, so why spend your time and resources working in those states?
So no candidates really pay attention to them.
Exactly. The flip side of that is only a few states, maybe even a few counties, actually decide the election. That's just wrong. It should be a national election. And another flip, sort of the third side of that odd-shaped coin, is that this whole system just depresses turnout. The analysis of a lot of people is you'd have at least 10 million additional votes if you had a national popular vote. Shouldn't we have an election system that actually encourages as many people as possible to go out and vote? Another problem is it distorts policy choices. If you had a national, had to appeal to all the voters, you would have to appeal to address the issues that all the voters consider important, that the majority of the voters consider important. You would not have the current policies on climate change in the administration if the administration had to go to all the people and ask for their votes. Another is, of course, it is a vestige of our history of slavery and white supremacy, and on principle, we should get rid of it, or at least figure out a way that it no longer continues to haunt our politics. Another is third parties. It just magnifies the problem of third party influence in our politics in ways that for third parties having influence when they actually don't have any chance of winning. You consider Wallace, a third-party manipulator. You consider Ross Perot. He thought he could win, but he may well have thrown the election to Bill Clinton. He may have influenced the result, even though he had no chance of winning. Schultz, who's just been considering throwing out the idea of doing the same, and Nader, 2000, Stein in 2016. I mean, it's just those third-party candidates had just way more influence and way more effect on our national politics than was deserved. So it's also, because it's so much emphasis is placed on one or even a few states, it makes the whole system fragile and vulnerable to outside manipulation, like by phony third parties or foreign influences. And it creates vulnerability to manipulation within the election system itself. This is malign intentional malfunctions like voter suppression, and then magnification of simple errors like an innocent error, like a poorly designed butterfly ballot in one county throws an entire national election into chaos. What kind of system is that?
It sure sounds like the system needs to be changed. So third, what are those exciting current initiatives for change? You've written on this, haven't you?
Yeah, I have a paper called Repairing Presidential Elections 2018-2020. So if you go on the website for Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections, it's on the first page. Just scroll down a little way on the first page, and there's a hyperlink to join an initiative to change the presidential election system or something like that. It's right there. But I think it'd be helpful to run through a little bit of history to put the current situation in context. In 2000, there was a big effort to amend the Constitution in '69. There were repeated efforts, 4 or 5 of them in subsequent years, never went anywhere. 2001, after the 2000 election, some legal scholars said, you know, we can address this problem in a different way, and that is because of the state-based nature of the Electoral College system. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution it defines how the Electoral College works. It says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. So it's up to each state, and the Supreme Court has said this in a case on it. It has plenary power to decide how it's going to choose its electors. As I said, initially legislatures elected electors, or chose electors. There's nothing to keep a state from saying, we want to be part of a national election. We want our electors to be the slate of individuals who win whose candidate wins the most votes, popular votes, nationwide. Like every other election we have in the United States, the person who gets the most votes is the one who gets elected. And so this is an election for president. It should be the one who gets the most votes for president who gets elected. So that's what these scholars were saying back in 2001. There was a lot of thinking about that for several years. And then in 2000, and the scholars also said, you know, there are different ways of going about this. You could have a de facto solution to the problem, which is if you had a bunch of big states on opposite sides of the political fence, like Texas and California and New York and Georgia, all agreeing that we're going to give our electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, well then, as a practical matter, de facto, the national popular vote is going to decide who wins the election. So that's one way. Another is if you had a bunch of battleground states, say Florida, Michigan, and Ohio. If they did that, then as a practical matter, that's going to be the basis on which the election is decided. And another way is you could have something called an Interstate Compact. A bunch of states could get together and agree that they are going to cast their votes for the winner of the national popular vote. So those were the options. And then in 2006, a new group called National Popular Vote Organization came to the fore, and they are still going gangbusters. And they said, we're going to go with the Interstate Compact approach. So states can sign up for this Interstate Compact, and as soon as states that have 270 electoral votes have agreed to cast their votes for the winner of the national vote, then that compact will go in force. It's like the no-risk approach to solving this problem. And state-based, no-risk approach to solving the problem. So that's how they went forward. They had a lot of success between 2006 and 2018. Then it stalled out between 2012 and 2018. They had success 2006, 2012, excellent start, 2012, 2018, stalled out. And now, and the problem in the stalled out period was the results of the 2010 election at the state level. Thanks to the 2018 state level election, things are going really well again. A bunch of states have recently joined the compact. We're at 189 electoral votes now. It takes 270 to have a majority. Oregon, Nevada, and Maine are pretty reasonable possibilities to be added, so that gets you to 2005.
So why were the state elections of 2010 and 2018 so important?
Well, it goes back to the Constitution and the approach that these folks are taking, which is it's all based on the states. And in 2010, it was a big wave election for the Republican Party, and the Republican Party did not. Well, the reality is, although there's been a lot of bipartisan support over the decades for fixing this system, and although National Popular Vote Organization has been really disciplined and strong in seeking for Republican support in all the work that it has done, the reality is the compact has only been signed up to by Democratic trifecta states. So the 2010 election, which is Republican wave, really stalled out the effort. Now the 2018 election, which is kind of a blue wave in the states, has opened up not the floodgates, but the sluices a bit, and it's moving forward. There's possibly another 13 electoral votes in Virginia after the 2019 election if Virginia becomes a blue trifecta, and that could get you as high as 2018.
Good. Well,
but 2018 is a long way from 2070, and that's about as far as you could go.
and that's a bit of a downer. What's the exciting part of the story?
Well, within a week of when this is being taped right now,
You mean just last week?
Yeah, just last week, the state authorities in Ohio approved a state-based initiative to put national popular vote on the ballot for the people to decide, not the politicians to decide, in 2019. And if that succeeds, then in 2020, Ohio will be casting its electoral votes for the winner of the national popular vote. And it was super exciting to me because this implements an idea that I've been pushing since January of 2017. Paul Tisson, eventually in October of 2017, actually authored a bill to put this issue before the Minnesota voters in the 2018 election, which would have been effective in the 2020 election at the federal level. And then Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections, the head of that is George Beck, by the way. I just want to give him a shout out here. Their board endorsed the...
And then didn't Keith Ellison support it?
Right.
In December?
Yep. Tisson was the first legislator in the country to take this step. Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections was the first election organization to support that, and then Keith Ellison, who at the time was the vice chair of the Democratic National Committee, also supported it. So to me, yeah, it's super, super exciting. And it's being supported by a new group, Making Every Vote Count, and their pro bono counsel, Covington and Burling, which is a really top-notch law firm in Washington, D.C. These are very serious, very sophisticated people. They support the Interstate Compact, as I do, and they were instrumental in helping get it through Connecticut in 2018. But as Ohio shows, they're also very much interested in this broader approach, such as citizen initiative campaigns, to help get over the top. Now, I have kind of a two-year perspective on this. 2 years ago, I tried to get National Popular Vote Organization, League of Women Voters, and some others to support this idea. So consider this thought experiment. What if Michigan, Ohio, and Florida had actually gone forward with that idea, and they all had really strong voter rights initiative campaigns, really successful in the 2018 elections? What if national popular vote had been added into that mix? And the law today was that in 2020, these three states and their 63 electoral votes will be cast for the national popular vote winner. What would that do to our politics? So then last week, I was kind of grieving that nothing was going to happen before 2021, and that there's this lost opportunity from 2017 to 2018. But now with Ohio, I'm just seeing all kinds of potential opportunities.
Well, I can see why you're excited. Aside from the remaining blue trifecta states in Ohio, are there other near-term prospects?
Well, yeah, there are actually. On its blog, Making Every Vote Count has a really great blog. If you're interested in this, you ought to just, every 2 or 3 times a day, I'm checking on the blog just to see what other really cool thing they're talking about. But a couple of weeks ago, they talked about states creating grassroots coalitions to push this idea forward. One had formed in New Mexico a couple of years ago, and that's helped get New Mexico on board just within the last few weeks. And Making Every Vote Count actually formed a grassroots coalition in Ohio just within the last week or two. So there are lots of opportunities for other grassroots coalitions to form over the next coming months. Perhaps Michigan and Florida and Missouri and Arizona, all of which have initiative, will decide they want to start circulating petition signatures among their populations for the 2020 election. Even states like Minnesota that don't have initiative, there would be reasons for them to form coalitions, grassroots coalitions. The issue may be important for the 2020 elections in Congress. You know, Congressperson, will you support a constitutional amendment? Will you approve this Interstate Compact that if it gets to 270 votes and 270 votes and comes back to you? And issue also in the state elections for where the compact hasn't been agreed to yet. You know, state legislator, will you support a national popular vote in the next legislative session, or will you at least let the people have the choice to express their views on whether the president ought to be the person who gets the most votes? So I also have, I'm going to offer a 2-month perspective now. 2 months ago, I gave a talk on this subject at the Critical Thinking Club in Stillwater, Minnesota. At that time, national popular vote was kind of a sleepy, backwater, wonky issue. Nobody was talking about it. Today, the issue as a whole has just exploded. Within that explosion of coverage, 10 days ago, almost nobody was talking about the idea of using initiative campaigns to get over the hump and to just sort of energize and solve this problem once and for all. Now that Ohio has happened, who knows, maybe in another 2 months, this is going to be a white-hot issue.
Well, let's make it white hot.
All right. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm excited too. We were going to cover objections to the Interstate Compact, and we do have a little more time.
Yeah.
Do you want to touch on those and perhaps weigh those objections?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I just want to say there are some resources that I think would be helpful. That my paper goes on into this at some length. So if you go on,
That's Every Vote Equal?
Yeah, no, my paper is Repairing Presidential Elections on the website that I mentioned before. Now, National Popular Vote Organization has a sort of the Bible, the compendium of stuff about the National Popular Vote movement. And if you go on their website, they'll send it to you for free, I think. But anyway, it's 1,000 pages long. It has 400 pages.
Wow.
Listing out all the objections and explaining what the answers to all those objections are. Again, the Making Every Vote Count blog, they address the questions, you know, an individual question almost every day, maybe every 2 or 3 days. So, but stepping back from that, within the time we've got, I'd say there are some philosophical objections that you hear voiced. One is that the national popular vote idea confuses the fact that we're a republic, not a democracy. Well, that sort of false dichotomy confuses the fact that in a republic, your representatives are elected. And the legitimacy of the Republican form of government, at least in the 21st century, depends on the democratic, the faithfulness of the election to democratic principles. So I mean, it's clear in the Federalist Papers that, you know, we select in a republic, we select our leaders through elections.
Yeah.
You know, and the idea
Not a plutocracy.
we're not a plutocracy, and the suggestion that we should be or could become a plutocracy, where the minority was ruling, was contrary to the whole spirit of the founding of this country. The other comment that you hear about is, oh, this is mob rule. Oh, the founders were worried about mob rule. Well, who's the mob? And who's the much feared demagogue that the founders were worried about? Is the mob those who accept the legitimacy of the scientific process that grew out of the Enlightenment, just like our founding grew out of the Enlightenment, and who accept the rigorously established facts of science? Is it those who believe in people and believe in their hearts that a legitimately elected representative is one who receives the most votes in an election? Is it one who thinks a more perfect union is one that would set aside the institutional vestiges of our slave and racist past? Or is it one who denies, ridicules, or refuses to act upon the hard facts that science teaches? One who seeks to exploit existing structures to establish minority rule. One who divides, who appeals to atavistic impulses, some of whose followers resort to racial insults. One who denigrates the institutions of society that hold government accountable and that seek to inform, to engage, and even to uplift the people.
I'd certainly say no to those last four.
Yeah, I guess my thoughts are pretty clear on that. There are a bunch of other sort of political, legal objections, and I'll try to sort of run through those in our remaining time. One is that elections would turn on a few large states or on the cities, and that all the rural and small town voters would be ignored, and this would just continue to, this would worsen our existing divide, political and cultural divide. Well, the truth is California and New York have only 16% of the votes. Anybody who campaigns only in California and New York is bound to have a landslide defeat. Rural America has 60 million people. Small town America has 30 million people. Millions of those people live in California and live in New York. Right now, they're all chopped up, you know, because for presidential political purposes, because they are relevant as voters only within their state. They're already being outvoted by the cities within their states. If you had a national election, you could have national coalitions like the Grange and the Farmers Union and so on. There are a lot of people in rural America who can see that climate change, dealing with climate change, and the economic revolution that alternative energy is going to create is an immense economic opportunity for rural America. It's just one example. So actually, and rural America, when they're in states that are already taken for granted, nobody's paying any attention to them. Nobody's coming and visiting them and trying to get their votes. But with modern technology, candidates can and must address the interests of all significant sectors of society. I mean, you can see a candidate going out to the middle of Nebraska and holding a town hall or a big rally in the middle of Nebraska, talking about rural issues that unite millions, tens of millions of rural voters, and having that address beamed to viewing parties all over the country. I mean, that's what people ought to do. Plus, there are a lot of low-cost ways with modern technology to reach people everywhere. So that's kind of a. The other thing is cities. I mean, if the rhetoric about cities. Okay, so you're talking about cities. You're probably talking about people whose skin is not white, right? But cities are part of metropolitan areas. You know, campaigns are going to be, and that's the vast majority of people are in metropolitan areas. And metropolitan areas have political viewpoints that encompass the entire spectrum. So to the extent that campaigns are focused on population centers, which of course to a great degree they will be, they're not just focusing on a narrow set of voters. They're focusing on a spectrum of voters, and they need to appeal to all of the significant political views within that spectrum. A Democrat would need to campaign in all of the metropolitan areas in Texas and Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee, and that does not happen today. A Republican would need to campaign in all the metropolitan areas of California and Washington and New York and New England, and that does not happen today. So then there's that's sort of the counterpart of the cities, large states argument is that national popular vote would be unfair to small states, which the Constitution was meant to protect. Well, I've already touched on that this is really a nothing burger of an argument, since it's equally balanced in our current politics. And small state interests are amply protected in the Senate and are not going to ever go away. Another argument is the Interstate Compact requires approval of Congress.
Really?
Yes, and it might. There's a provision of the Constitution that states can form interstate compacts, and Congress should approve them. But there's Supreme Court law that has very narrowly interpreted that. So it's possible that it doesn't need to go to Congress, and it's possible that it does. If states pass freestanding laws, like those initiatives that might go forward in Ohio and Michigan and Florida and Arizona, those aren't compacts. Those are just states deciding, that this is what they're going to do on their own, whether or not they are also in the compact. Mm-hmm. States that are currently in the compact can pass freestanding laws. Like in 2020, you know what? We're going to actually start casting our votes for the winner of the national popular vote. I mean, what if California did that and Washington did that? Already in 2020, we would see perhaps 100, 150 votes cast for the winner of the national popular vote. Then the country would see how it works, see how the system works, realize that it's a very straightforward system, a very common sense system. So anyway, and if the compact does reach 270, I think it should go to Congress. But
to approve it?
To approve it. I mean, why not? If they don't approve it, you can still argue, well, they didn't need to approve it. But for the most part, I think when you get close to 270, states should just start passing their own laws as a backstop to the compact. Another argument is these initiative campaigns I've been talking about aren't going to work because the Constitution says the legislatures are the ones who decide. Let me be a little more precise about that. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So arguably, if you're going to an initiative campaign, it's the citizens, not the legislature, that's making the decision, and therefore that's out of bounds. The problem with that argument is that the law is all to the contrary. The Constitution uses the word legislature in a lot of different places. It also uses the word Congress in a lot of different places. And it means two things. In some contexts, it means the body acting as a legislative, as a legislative, corporate entity.
Yeah.
In other cases, it means the entire lawmaking structure of the state. And in this case, it clearly means the entire lawmaking structure, which includes
initiative.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Another argument is that this would lead to a proliferation of third-party candidates. Our beloved two-party system would be lost, and it's just going to be total chaos. Well, the third-party candidate problem is worse under the current system than it could ever possibly be under the national popular vote system. To be viable, and to have any impact on the election, a third-party candidate would need to be a major, legitimate force in the election. Otherwise, they're wasting their time. And the best analogy in the U.S. is governor races. where we elect our chief executive based on who gets the most votes. And almost all, not all of them, but Jesse Ventura is an exception, but those are normally two-party contests. But if you want to solve the problem, you can think about ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting as a solution. It's been proposed.
What we already have in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Yeah, and it's building momentum all across the country. It's a really sound system. It minimizes, it tamps down partisan rhetoric. I vote in Minneapolis. I love it. I love it. But you could add that on to a constitutional amendment. Say Congress, if it wishes, can pass laws to implement ranked choice voting. It might be a little early now, but so I personally I wouldn't force it on the country in a constitutional amendment. I'd have the amendment, give Congress the leverage. You could also put that amend the compact, so that say you have everybody votes. The compact states pay attention to everybody's vote. But if we're getting a fractured party system, you could say if it's less than 40%, then the members of the compact are going to just look at their own votes and use ranked choice voting within their own body of votes. And that would be a big incentive for other people to join the compact. You've got Florida and Ohio and Michigan and California, and they're all going to use ranked choice voting. Maybe you'd like to get your voters into that game as well. So anyway, it's a thought. Another big frequent argument is...
Yeah, we've got about 6 minutes left.
Yeah, I know, and I want to leave as early as I can. So there's the nightmare of a national recount. Oh my God, what if we have to have a recount? Remember Florida in 2000. Well, I do remember Florida in 2000, and the fact is that the nightmare of recounts that could affect the outcome of a presidential election is a lot more likely in the current system.
Yes.
Where you're focusing on just a few states, and where the margins of error could be very close in those states. I mean, those are the states which are close in the first place. I mean, that's why they're battleground states. Whereas if you had 130 million votes, the likelihood that you're going to have anything that's close enough to need a recount is next to zero. Not zero, but pretty close to zero. But if there were a recount, it would be up to each of the 51 states to decide whether to do a recount. Remember, this is based on the right of each state to decide how its electors will be chosen. So no state is forcing any other state to do a recount. If a state's not even part of the Interstate Compact, it's not going to do a recount. If a state is part of the Interstate Compact, it could do a recount if it wants. That'd be fine. And
so it would not be a nightmare.
It would not be a nightmare. And in fact, compare Florida in 2000 and its attempt to do a recount, statewide recount in 2000 within the time limits. You got to get it done because you can't wait like in the Al Franken election. You can't wait 6 months to get a result. So anyway, the technology, the systems for doing recounts are improving by leaps and bounds. So that helps. And finally, Bush versus Gore, as awful as that case was, it gives us an answer that solves the problem. If you can't get a recount done in time to meet the time limits, then you use the original certified results. So you've got a clear set of rules. Anyway, there are a few sort of BS arguments. There's an argument that this is an end run around the Constitution's amendment process. It's not. It's just a ridiculous argument.
Yeah.
And an argument that differing state election laws are going to create a nightmare or inequities. We've got differing state election laws now. This Interstate Compact just uses the same laws. There's absolutely no change. So that's run through. We've run through that. I hope that Minnesota will soon have a coalition.
Yeah.
And I hope those of you who are interested in election politics, or you're part of election organizations, I hope you'll give the idea of such a coalition and joining a coalition and talking to your friends and neighbors and representatives about this idea. I hope you'll give it a good
It's
hearing.
becoming a hot issue.
It is. It's really exciting to me.
So, thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you again for the opportunity to do this.
Well, I'm so glad that we took enough time to cover it all.
Yeah, I know. We were talking about trying to do this in half an hour. Can you imagine that? I would be talking so fast you would have no idea what I said.
Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you. Great. This was fun. Oh, we're still being on.
Nope.